Hola, quiero darles la bienvenida a SMARTS, un programa de MuseArts patrocinado por el Canada Council for the Arts, el cual es una serie de talleres, conversaciones y espacios para el desarrollo profesional, desarrollo de competencias y el intercambio de conocimientos en temas como cultura, comunidad, inclusión, derechos humanos, desde una perspectiva de antiopresión. También exploramos conocimientos, herramientas y recursos digitales para impactar positivamente la carrera de artistas con intereses en arte comunitaria, con experiencias de refugio o inmigrantes. En esta serie de conversaciones estará moderada por Mónica Aguirre, una de nuestras colaboradoras en Colombia. Que las disfruten.
Hi there, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you. I'm Parul Pandya, and I'll be leading you through the workshop today. And we're going to be talking about understanding and applying anti-oppression. Previous to that, I just want to say a big thank you to MuseArts for inviting us through their SMARTS program, which is a wonderful professional development resources tool for wonderful artists and creatives. And they've given us the space to be able to share with you today. So I just wanted to say a big thank you to MuseArts for inviting us into the session today. And as mentioned today, we're going to be speaking about understanding and applying anti-oppression. So before we get started, I won't spend too much time here, but just want to quickly introduce myself. As I mentioned to you, my name is Parul Pandya. I am the founder and a community consultant at Community Impact Consulting. Please do check us out if you so feel inclined. We're at communityimpactconsulting.org. And I have been working in the nonprofit sector for over 25 years with a specialization in working with systemically marginalized communities. I'm not going to spend too much more time there. Please do check us out if you want more information on the work that we do. And I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Sienna, to quickly introduce herself.
Hi all, I'm Sienna, and I've been working with Community Impact for the past year and a half now, and we've put together a series of workshops with different organizations and also resources for workshop attendees. After this session in particular, we'll be sharing 2 resources for you to continue your learnings. The first will be an anti-oppression toolkit to supplement the learning that we had today and the concepts discussed. The second will be a reading list highlighting a number of BIPOC writers.
Thank you so much, Sienna. And with that being said, let's get right into the workshop. So let's start with a really critical conversation, and understanding that is really essential, I think, for anybody who's doing any community work. And that is understanding the difference between equality and equity. And today we're going to be looking at it from the lens of how it relates to our community. So as you can see with the left-hand side image that speaks to equality, when it comes to community resources, what we can observe is that exactly the same amount of community resources are going to the 2 different communities that are represented in that image. However, we can quickly identify that one community has far more infrastructure. You see something that looks like a hospital, a church, maybe some buildings, office buildings, residential buildings, and a little bit of green space. Not too many trees, but some trees nonetheless. Meanwhile, in the equality image on the left-hand side of that particular image, we see a community that looks a little broken down, right? And lacks that infrastructure. So what we really want to glimpse through this visual is that equality assumes that everybody needs exactly the same thing. Now, with equity, which is a central concept when it comes to anti-oppression work, what we really want to recognize is that we invest in communities based on needs. So what you see in the first image changes and shifts quite drastically in the second image, which is entitled equity. And what we see is that certain resources on that left-hand side of the equity image, more resources are being funneled into one community in order for it to develop infrastructure like the community on the right-hand side of the equity image. So the big learning to really grasp here is that with equality, it really is about sameness, that exactly the same thing goes to every community. But we know that we are not born into, an equitable society. So with equity, what we see is that we're, rather than, going based on sameness, we're actually adjusting based on needs. So equality assumes that we need exactly the same thing, and equity challenges that and says we should actually be investing in communities based on needs. Therefore, certain resources may go in more abundance to particular communities. And that's okay, because those communities have been invested in, fewer and less than those communities that, are thriving and established already. So that is something I just want you to hold in your mind as we continue on with the workshop. So there is a wonderful article that was written in the early 1980s by scholar and educator Peggy McIntosh. And this article is actually available to you online. If you simply just Google search it, you'll be able to pull it up. And it's about a 4 or 5 page article, and it's entitled "White Privilege: Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack." Now, I just want to, before I get into the quotation, I just want to give you the context of when the article was written. As I mentioned, it was in the early 1980s, and it was written by a white woman scholar. And it was pretty groundbreaking at the time. It was groundbreaking at the time because it was one of the first times that, a white individual was really calling in her own privilege on such a large stage. And I think I wanted to share one quote with you from the article because I think it really paints a wonderful and firm picture of some of the things that we want to think about and discuss in this workshop today. So Peggy says, "I was taught to see racism only in an individual acts of meanness, not in invisible systems conferring dominance on my group." And she goes on in the article to really explain that and talk about how she realizes that, as soon as she walks through the door, or out the door, I should say, and enters the world, that she is given certain privileges that other folks are just not given, such as those that may, rely on some sort of a device to get around, or, a person of color, for example. So it was, as I mentioned, a really groundbreaking article. And I really encourage you on your own time to, pick it up online and have a read and think about the time that she wrote it, and just how she actually really aided in bringing this language to the mainstream. And that's something we, want to consider as we go along. So where does this lead us in terms of, what can we do as community workers, as artists, as creatives that work with people? Well, we really want to think about approaching our work in a culturally competent way. Cultural competence is really about being able to acquire the sufficient knowledge of a culture, of a diverse group, to increase tolerance, understanding, and acceptance, as well as reduce stereotypes, misunderstandings, and prejudice. So as many of you will, already know, we never work with one community the same as another community. So cultural competency really lends towards taking the time to learn about that particular community. There may be specific protocols, there may be certain practices that are really essential to getting to know that community. And in the health, community, and social care context, it's important that we not only allow those folks to feel like they are accepted, but we also want to give them the help and the support they need in order for them to then build their capacity from the inside. So for communities to be able to self-determine, and that's a really critical terminology. Self-determination is about having access, to these opportunities the same as anyone. And so that really comes back to that concept of equity. And we want to think about it and the vitality of it because of the importance of being culturally sensitive and respectful with communities when we work with them, when we collaborate them, and when we approach them. So let's get right into talking about oppression. How do we recognize oppression? In what ways do they show up in our everyday lives? Well, today we're going to be speaking about 4 different ways in which oppression shows up. The first is on a personal level. These are things like our values, our beliefs, and our feelings. So, a really vital example of that could be looking at something like, organized religion. And that though organized religion has really brought together, millions and millions of people, it also has been very divisive, in the sense that, if you do not believe in that particular, way of thinking, you may be adversarial in the sense of thinking what I believe is right and what you believe is wrong. The God or gods that I believe in are real, and your gods are not. So it's really important to see how that, has been able to bring people together. Religion has brought people together, but it has continually been divisive. And this is something that we can see, from history into the present time. The second way in which oppression shows up is interpersonally. And these are things like our action, our behaviors, and our language. And a great example of this is, if you are someone who is a settler in a new land and may come, with a different language as a first language, how do people make the effort to want to connect with you? So when you're offering, your services, or you're connecting with communities, are you talking to them in their, connecting with them in their mother tongue or their original language? Are we creating, marketing materials, or are we community engaging around the ways that people feel comfortable and accessible to them within that exchange? So interpersonally is also very important. Thirdly is institutionally, and these are things like rules, policies, and procedures. One of the biggest, things that we have seen highlighted in the last few years is definitely, the argument or the pushing of the case, for example, of defunding the police. Now, some folks will say, well, what would that look like? Why are people even, saying something so extreme? Well, the reality is that a lot of institutional powers like police really do have, policies and procedures that are harmful, that are based in colonial ways of thinking. And we have to also understand that policing in many countries really did emerge as a way of oppressing and controlling certain bodies, and those were bodies of color, or those who, were marginalized as a result of colonization. And then fourthly is culturally. And these are things that are beautiful, considered beautiful, truthful, and rightful. So, a quick example of that is, for example, in South Asian culture, in African culture, they do have this horrible practice of placing bleach into face creams. Now, this is something that is primarily targeted towards a lot of women that belong in cultures of color. And what it is about is really, again, based on that colonial legacy that the lighter you appear in your skin, the more beautiful you are considered. So, pale or being whiter is really considered the aesthetic that one wants to reach in order to be considered beautiful. And this is very much the legacy of colonization. In fact, it's led to the emergence of such, understandings and terminologies like shadeism. And for those who are not familiar with shadeism, essentially it is the concept that, again, within your cultural group, your ethnic group, the lighter you are, the more beautiful you are considered. So we want to think of, again, how it is that we encounter oppression on a daily basis, and that it may show up on a variety of these levels. So let's get right into acquainting ourselves with some terminology about oppression. Firstly, let's talk about the agents of oppression. Who are they? Well, agents of oppression are members of the dominant social group who are privileged by birth or acquisition, which knowingly and unknowingly exploit and reap unfair advantage over members of groups that are referred to as targets of oppression. And we're going to get to that in just a few moments. What we really want to hold on to here is that it is these agents of oppression that really do define what is considered normal, what is considered normative. And, they see themselves as that. And that's usually comes, again, from the dominant group, right? Who are the agents of oppression. And as a result of that, as you can imagine, many people are left on the outside, or they're othered. So, they are seen as a result of not being, quote unquote, normal, as being evil, as being deviant, as being abnormal, substandard, and sometimes even defective. So as you can see, there's a lot of power and agency that is given to agents of oppression in really kind of establishing how things go on the day-to-day and what's considered normal and versus what is not. And that can obviously be very, very detrimental to those who, don't look a certain way or act a certain way or identify a certain way. Let's move into talking about targets of oppression. Targets of oppression are members of social identity groups that are disenfranchised, exploited, and victimized in a variety of ways by agents of oppression. And this is done by the agent's systems and their institutions. They are seen and treated as expendable and replaceable without an individual identity apart from the group. So that's something that we really want to think about. Because often what happens is, again, we kind of perpetuate ideas of cultural groups based on stereotypes. So, what we have seen historically, for example, is, the mistreatment not only of, Black folks across the board, but in this specific example I'm going to give, of Black men, right? So Black men are kind of seen as, criminal. There's that kind of stereotype that, thug or, someone that really is, a threat to others in society. And again, we can look at that extending to the way that Indigenous people are often looked at, as being, in Canada, for example, there's a lot of thoughts around them not being productive members of society, that they're just complainers, that times have changed and things need to change as a result of the times, and that they're just not being accepting of that. And as a result of that pressure and that lack of acceptance for them, and what it is that is important to those people in their own unique, lived experiences and cultures, these folks are really left vulnerable. And as a result of that, are really subjected to exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. And when we're talking about violence, we don't necessarily only mean physically, we also mean emotional and spiritual violence. In fact, we have really seen that, over the last few months, I should say years, but definitely in the last few months, with the highlighting of the atrocities that happened in Indian residential schools. And for those who are not familiar, Canada, the government of Canada, co-opted and participated with the Christian church to steal Indigenous children from their home and essentially strip away their entire culture through an education system. And this is not only something that has happened in Canada. Unfortunately, this is a reality that a lot of Indigenous children have the legacy of trauma to carry. So where does this leave us in terms of understanding how these two groups interact with one another? Well, firstly, targets of oppression are kept in place by the agents of oppression's ideology, which supports oppression by denying that it exists in the first place. And then additionally, what it does is it blames the conditions of the oppression on those who are the targets. So what we want to really recognize here is that oppression is something that is far more sinister than we may even give a first glance at. Look at in first glance, because ultimately at the end of the day, what it does is not only make you feel, small as an individual, but it makes you feel that you don't fit in, amongst society, amongst others. And it actually blames you for the conditions of your oppression. And this is something that is very critical to recognize, that we who are marginalized are often blamed for the conditions of our life in a personal way, and that we actually don't have anything to do with it in reality. This is just kind of the cards that we've been dealt. Now, this is an important piece that I really want to take some care and time with, and that's talking about internalized oppression. Now, many people of color experience internalized oppression, and many of those who also belong to other marginalized groups, such as those who are deaf or are living with some sort of disability. And internalized oppression is the process whereby people in the target group make oppression internal and personal by coming to believe the lies, prejudices, and stereotypes about them as true. One thing that we have learned through this work is that this is an area that still needs deep care and exploration. You know, we have met thousands of learners over, you know, the course of our time. And with that being said, we have learned that many folks still carry a lot of that trauma that they have, you know, grown up with into their adulthood. And that often we are, you know, taught that for survival, we have to push down these traumas in order to, you know, be able to kind of fit in every day, in order to move on with our lives. And I'm going to really say that I think that this is very harmful, and that we have to actually take time to, you know, heal ourselves and admit some of the things that we may have experienced or others around us that we care about may have experienced that have really traumatized them. And as a result of that, you know, folks who really demonstrate internalized oppression often change their attitudes, behaviors, speech, and self-confidence to reflect the stereotypes or that normal we'd spoken about of the dominant group. So let's define oppression. We've spoken about it and how it is that we can recognize it, but what is oppression at its core? Oppression is the use of power to disempower, marginalize, silence, or otherwise subordinate one social group or category, often in order to further empower or privilege the oppressor. Social oppression may not require formally established organizational support to achieve its desired effect. It may be applied on a more informal yet focused individual basis. So that really is, you know, a long way of saying we are not only navigating, you know, as people of color, as people that belong to systemically marginalized groups, we're usually not encountering oppression in just one way. We're you know, and we're having to confront oppression on a personal level, how our bodies, how our cultures, how our minds are treated on an individual basis. But then we also have to talk about how it is that we relate to oppression as we move through the world, and how it is that that oppression shows up in our everyday life. So where does this lead us? Well, this leads us to the cycle of systemic oppression, or something that we can also refer to as power economics. And if I may, I'm just going to use Sienna and I as an example. So if Sienna and I are sitting down and having a conversation, and, you know, I say something that is a stereotype, and we both kind of giggle at it, and, you know, we form this this conversation, and we, you know, formulate this stereotype. And then what happens is that Sienna goes home and I go home, and then I tell 10 people, and Sienna goes and tells 10 people. And all of a sudden, something that started as this like intimate stereotype between two people, all of a sudden has momentum, and it starts spreading. And that's when it turns into a prejudice, is when something that starts as a stereotype really starts infiltrating, you know, different folks and in different minds, and starts spreading. So you can almost look at it like a wildfire that begins to spread. Now, when does a prejudice turn into a discrimination? Well, it turns into a discrimination when it actually starts being enacted in different laws and policies and procedures, or lack of those things in our everyday lives. And then it turns into an oppression from a discrimination when we are the ones who are experiencing it. When we are the ones who are, you know, walking through into the world every day and encountering the world the way that it is. And then we know it doesn't only end there. There's also the interpersonal level in which we relate to oppression, the way that it affects us on a personal level. So what, as I mentioned, you know, right off the top, this is something we refer to as power economics. And as you can see, this is a cycle that perpetuates itself. It doesn't take much effort. And this power economics is something that has been perfected. And I really stress it's been perfected over centuries, that sometimes we're not even able to see how this cycle of systemic oppression works and just how sinister it is. So this is something we want to empower you to be able to recognize, to interrupt, as well as to also take the opportunity to be kind to yourself if you have experienced oppression, from a variety of angles. What is that all to say? Well, it's all to say that oppression is connected. All oppression is connected. As I mentioned right off the bat, when we experience oppression, we don't tend to experience it only from one place or one angle. It's actually something that is intersectional. And that really refers to the idea that a lot of these different angles of our lives and our experiences come together. They come together, they're intersectional. So as you can see, from this wonderful word chart, there are just a variety of ways that we can reflect on how oppression shows up in our society and how it is that it may affect us or it may not affect us. However, the important thing to do is to really deeply dig into ourselves and understand that though these may not be our experiences, we cannot relate to them perhaps, that these are experiences that others do live with every day. So whether you're on the side of, being someone who feels they are oppressed, or you may feel like the most liberal person in the world, the bottom line is that we have to have empathy, that we have to care for each other, and recognize that all oppression is connected. Now let's move into being able to identify how oppression, and privilege kind of complement one another. That is to say, oppression cannot exist without privilege. And privileges are unearned, and they are often granted to people that, again, belong to that dominant group, whether they want these privileges or not. I just want to spend a moment with that thought, because a lot of times we will encounter folks in contemporary society that said, well, you know what, I was not responsible for that harm that was, done to, women, or I was not, responsible for that harm that was, bestowed on communities of color. Well, ultimately, if we all deflect that responsibility, then nobody actually takes the responsibility. And if we are settlers in a land that is, from the legacy of colonization, then we are all responsible, because we are reaping the benefits by living on the land, by functioning in the culture of, and by living in the societies that we live. So we are all responsible. And it is often people in the dominant group that are unaware that they are members of the dominant group, because obviously you're not going to recognize when you don't have access to something, or you don't have certain, power. And we're going to get into that in just a few moments. What you are going to, when you're going to be really aware of it, is when you do not possess privileges, when you do not possess power. Because you're going to be able to, quickly identify that you're not given that agency. So privilege, much like oppression, operates on a personal, interpersonal, cultural, and institutional level, and gives advantages, favors, and benefits to members of that dominant group. And sadly, it is often at the expense of members of the target group. Now, in today's society, we can really, again, tie this back to Eurocentric, North American colonial privilege. And that folks that, again, do not have membership in one or more of these social identities that we're going to just speak about in just a moment, really do experience oppression from a multitude of angles. So folks that tend to, experience perhaps the least amount of challenge when it comes to their everyday lives, because they belong to these social identity groups. And those are white folks or white people, able-bodied people. And when we say able-bodied, we mean that your body is not, you are not living with some sort of physical or mental disability, those who are heterosexual, those who are male, those who are cis-bodied persons. And what we refer to as cis-bodied persons is that you actually identify with the body that you are born into. So for example, a person who is a trans person is not going to identify as cis-bodied. Also, neurotypical persons, as we know, a variety of us have, all of us have different brains. And as a result of that, we are very neurodiverse. Those who are Christian, those who are middle or owning class people, middle-aged people, and English-speaking people. Now let's just pause here for a moment and let's look at that list. And what's something that may jump out to you when you actually look at that list? That's right. It's exactly that. It leaves behind so many people. In fact, I would say it leaves behind more members of society than it actually accounts for. So again, we're really able to identify that a small group of individuals really do reap an unfair advantage over a majority of individuals. In fact, we often have referred to, cultural groups or ethnocultural groups as the minority. Well, the reality is in a country like Canada that the minority is the majority. So we have to think about how we can kind of move away from that understanding that we are less than, that we are marginal compared to, the other folks in society. We have value. So where does this lead us into how we can actually become active participants in dismantling oppression? Well, something I would love to introduce you to is this concept of anti-oppressive practice, otherwise referred to as AOP. What does anti-oppressive practice look like? Well, firstly, we want to recognize that it emerges from social justice and equity rather than equality. And if you remember, that was the very first slide we looked at, and we talked about that distinguishment between equity and equality. The important thing to note here with AOP is that liberation is not about, liberation of just a particular group of people. It is about liberation as a goal that is inclusive of all people. And understanding that different, measures and different approaches and different amounts of, investment are going to be needed based on just exactly where that group, is at this particular moment. Secondly, it's about interdisciplinary approach that is rooted primarily within the practice of social work that focuses on ending socioeconomic oppression. It's important to recognize that where AOP emerged from was actually from social workers. So a variety of social workers, were starting to identify that one, if not the only, common factor that really was able to be readily identified was that a lot of the clients they were working with that were experiencing oppression in a variety of different forms were experiencing socioeconomic oppression. They were living with a lot of pressure in and around socioeconomic existence. So they really did identify that as being, one of the primary identifiers that was very common amongst their clients. Thirdly, the wonderful thing that AOP does is it invests in lived experience as the vessel of learning and context. So it places value on uniqueness, something that we don't necessarily do very well in contemporary society. We don't recognize that, based on someone's lived experiences, they're going to have value and opinions and have contributions that are valuable to the conversations that we are having, to the spaces that we are creating. It also underlines that privilege and oppression coexist. One cannot exist without the other. And we've explored that a little earlier. It recognizes that social and institutional inequities play a major role in systemic oppression. So these systems have been created. We did not create them. In fact, we would probably never create them if we had a choice. So that is something we want to really, stand strong in, that, we are not willing and we are not going to tolerate being, taken advantage of by these systems that we never supported in the first place. And so that's often why you will hear language like dismantling, right? Because a lot of these systems have been tried to be refined or tried to be reformed, and they have not successfully been reformed. So it gets to a point where you start to think, maybe this is not fixable, this system. Maybe we just have to create new systems. It also overtly names the roles we play in oppressing others and the complex, often unrecognized ways in which we do it. So I just want to flash back, if we can, just for a moment, to the targets of oppression and the agents of oppression. And I'm going to use that for an example here, because I think one thing that we have to really accept and understand is that we're not necessarily only one or the other, that we can be both, and depending on the circumstance. So this is not about saying, again, right, that this person is bad or this cultural group is bad or this group of individuals are bad. We all can be responsible for, supporting as well as harming others. So we have to be able to recognize that within the way that we interact and care for others. It also encourages inherent self-reflection and recognition of personal positioning within a community, classroom, job, national, and international context. What I really want to stress here is that when we have this, when we show up in different spaces, we may be viewed differently, that we're not going to be viewed the same way by, in two different spaces or by two different communities. So we have to understand that sometimes, a way that a community may perceive you or receive you will be a little different than what you may expect. And this may not be because, they don't like you or appreciate you. The bottom line is that many communities that are oppressed have been treated historically very bad. And so as a result of that, they are a little suspicious. It takes a little more time to build that trust with them in order to collaborate with them, in order to exchange with them. So the important thing here is that, we don't get defensive, that we understand why it is that someone or that community may feel the way that they feel. And that is not something personal. This is simply because they are responding to the way that they have been treated in the past. And that's something we have to carry if we want to really care for the communities that we work with. And as promised, we will have a discussion on power. What exactly is power? Well, power is access to resources, decision-making in order to get what you want done, and the access to influence others. The ability and means to define reality for yourself, and as a result, potentially for others. Power is a rather elusive concept, right? But what you're going to know is that you do not have access to power opposed to when you do have power, because you're going to know you don't have the ability to be able to, for example, vote, right? Or, have a seat at the table to have a voice, in that community meeting, for example. So power can be visible, hidden, or invisible, and show as power over others, power with others, and or power within. So it's something to consider, again, when through the dynamic of the work that you do, especially as it relates to the communities you work with. What are the 5 types of power that exist in society? Firstly, there is coercive power, and that's power through manipulation, violence, or fear of loss. An example, a very straightforward example of that would be the police. For example, if I went out and I broke a law, I will have certain things taken away from me in terms of privileges, or I will be fined. So really coercive power is the ability to say you're going to have certain, privileges taken away from you as a result of violating something that is thought of as valuable to society or that particular, city or town or reserve that you may live on. Those are definitely things that are governed, by those external institutions. Secondly is reward power, and that's the ability to reward compliance by having monetary and resource control due to proximity and privilege. So an example of this would be large corporations. And we've seen this abundantly, especially during the years of this pandemic that continues to play out. We saw that, the Walmarts of the world and the Costcos of the world were open during the height of the pandemic. And we saw that Amazon just continued to grow, its wealth as a result of the pandemic, and in fact has increased its wealth as a result of the pandemic. Now, what we saw that was not a way of, identifying equity is that a lot of small businesses were shut down, and they were not able to, sustain themselves and have any sort of output unless if they kind of went to an online output during this time of pandemic. So that is a clear example of reward power, that we see certain, privileges being given to certain organizations or corporations as a result of who they are, financially, and how much wealth they have access to. Thirdly is legitimate power, and that's having institutional positions with authority and decision-making control on inclusion. So our government would be a huge example of that. The local governments that you're working with, or, the local governments that you are living with in terms of, where it is that you dwell and live your everyday life. These folks are really kind of setting, again, the rules, the policies, the priorities of what is considered important, what is not considered important, what will be invested in, what will not be invested in. Fourthly is expert power, and this is from actual experiences, skills, or knowledge. Now, expert power is something that is very powerful in many communities of color, because a lot of times we've had to leave behind parts of ourselves, whether it's our cultural assets, whether it's the land that we lived on. The bottom line is that expert power is very, very important to being able to preserve culture and stories, to be quite honest. So an example of that would be elders in the indigenous culture. So as we know, many indigenous groups around the world really have been extracted from. They've had their resources taken. They've had their, their cultural and artistic artifacts taken, stolen. Perhaps they've shown up in a museum, right? And so the bottom line is that there has to be a way for us to be able to hold our cultural stories and preserve them that is not necessarily in a physical way, because we know that physical things can be intruded on and taken away. So expert power holds a great value to many cultures, And lastly, there's collective power. And now this is not a formally recognized type of power, but you know what? I really honestly do believe it is legitimate, and that this is a type of power where we all have agency. And that is collective power. And this is when a large group of people work together towards a common cause. So what is a powerful example of that? We can look at the civil rights movement that happened, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the importance of collective power is, highlighted through the intelligence of Dr. King, because Dr. King was not naive. He knew that he was going to be a target. He was going to be a target of the police. He was going to be a target of the government. He was going to be a target in a variety of different ways. So Dr. King was smart enough to identify that it was about, enacting, making people, other Black folks and allies really feel like they had agency towards coming together and using their voices, so that if for whatever reason he was no longer able to hold that space or place, that his legacy and the work that he did and the emotions and desires he stirred in the individuals that he, was able to reach really did carry forward. And how intelligent and how ahead of his time was Dr. King, because as we know, he was assassinated. And so it took, the efforts and the mobilization of those who carried forward in his legacy, and carries into his legacy today with such movements as Black Lives Matter, really is an extension of the civil rights movement. So collective power is important. It is legitimate. When we come together as people towards a certain cause or for a particular moment, we have the ability to influence, coercive, reward, legitimate, and expert power. So let's make sure that we remember that we are powerful, and as individuals and communities alike. Now, microaggressions are something that many of us encounter, and we may not be aware of the fact that this is what a microaggression is, but let's get right into that. What is a microaggression? Well, microaggressions are everyday verbal or behavioral exchanges that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults to certain individuals in a group because of their group membership. Oftentimes, unfortunately, the person who has made the statement is oblivious to the fact that such microaggressive speech is demeaning and can have unintended emotional and social repercussions to its recipient. Really, that's a way of saying microaggressions are involved making assumptions about the experience of one person based on stereotypes or perceived generalizations. So what do we do before a microaggression happens? Well, firstly, we really want to start from a grounded place. We have to look at ourselves before we can kind of turn that light on those who we work with. So firstly, we need to recognize and reflect on our own biases, interactions, and behaviors. Now, unconscious bias is something that exists in all of us. Nobody is free of bias. We all have unconscious biases, whether we recognize them or we don't. So we really do want to be honest with ourselves and thinking, what are some of the ways that I think that may actually come from a place based on simply my own experience, but not be, not be considerate of others' experiences. Secondly, we want to understand a general definition of a microaggression, which we just spoke about, and consider the various ways that they may manifest themselves and impact the way we have, the way that we interact with the people that we work with or care for or create artwork with. So that's really about understanding intent versus impact. And that sometimes we may have good intentions, right? I don't think many of us approach our work thinking, oh my gosh, I want to go in there and have bad intentions, but that sometimes good intentions can have harmful impacts. And again, this can be intentionally or unintentionally, but we have to be able to recognize that and take responsibility if, the legacy or the interactions of what we're doing does end up causing some level of harm to an individual or a community. It's also about understanding our own triggers and unpacking them. What makes you feel uncomfortable and why? How can you work through this discomfort? Like, how can you challenge yourself? Because when we're working, in an against anti-oppression, and when we're working with recognizing and confronting microaggressions, likely it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be a not nice feeling. And in the beginning, it's really about focusing on collaboratively establishing norms for discussion or dialogue. So again, taking the time to be able to really figure out, what works best, not only for you, but for the group collectively, and being able to be honest and open about those needs through that open and very vital discussion that happens not only at the beginning, but throughout the course of the exchange you are having with a community or communities. So let's get into some examples of what a microaggression may look like. So I'm not going to spend too much time here because there is a visual tool that is obviously on the screen right now that gives you some examples of what a microaggression may look like. But I'm going to just focus on using a racial microaggression, as an example. So if someone asks you, where are you from? Where are you really from? No. Where are you really, really from? Okay, for folks that belong to a racialized group that are, partaking in this workshop, I am going to guess that there's 100% chance probability that you have been asked this question, because we get asked this question a lot of times, especially as racialized people. So when someone is asking you, where are you from? The interesting thing to notice is that when they're asking you where you're from, they're making the assumption that you are not from here, right? So what you want to actually ask someone is, what do you actually intend to ask them, I imagine, is what is their cultural background? So if you are asking someone where they're from, I would actually say, instead of asking them that, maybe ask them, what is your cultural background, or where do you originate from? Because that is more specific. Because when you are making the assumption by asking them, where are you from? Again, you're making the observation that they're not from there. And you don't know that's necessarily true. In fact, I've seen that happen multiple times, over the course of our exchanges and, physical spaces that I've been in, where someone, for example, will say, well, my cultural background is that, I am from Africa. I'm, African. However, I am second generation Canadian. So again, we don't want to make those assumptions. Again, things like saying you don't act like a normal Black person. Well, what does a normal Black person act like versus an abnormal Black person, right? So we're always making these kind of comments, where we don't really actually understand the intent of how it makes the person feel when we make these sorts of comments. And again, these are assumptions that are based on stereotypes and assumptions. So how do we deal with a microaggression when it happens? Because it really can be confusing and overwhelming and also scary, because there are a variety of things that we really need to consider in that moment before we are able to act on it. So firstly, we need to acknowledge the moment and immediately take the lead in addressing the situation. So whether it's a microaggression that happens to us or something that we witness that happens to another, we want to slow down or stop the conversation. We want to make sure that we acknowledge it the moment that it happens. Because often, as human nature dictates, once we kind of put things off, then we can kind of talk ourselves out of it, right? If we kind of sit there with it, we might be like, well, maybe I misheard that. Or, you know what, maybe I am overreacting. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. Or maybe I didn't hear that properly. And that's human nature, is we kind of talk ourselves out of confrontational or uncomfortable situations. So really, it's taking that moment to breathe, pause, and stay as calm as possible. Because if we are interrupting a microaggression in an aggressive way, likely is the person who was the deliverer of that microaggression is going to become defensive, is going to shut down or shut off. So we really want to create a tone where we're not being aggressive, but we are being honest and open and invitational and reflective of that particular moment as a livable moment. Also, it's important to hold everyone accountable for their actions and ask for clarification. Explain why that incident is problematic and support critical reflection on the situation. So it's, again, not only about the confrontation, but saying, if, for example, Sienna said something problematic, it's really important that I confront her in a way that says, do you realize what you said? Do you realize why that might be hurtful to someone? So we really want to make that person really self-reflect about what it is that they said and why it might be problematic, or why it is problematic. It also is about acknowledging the emotions in the room, both visible and invisible, because they do exist, right? So again, back to that breathe, pause. It really is key that, we take care of the way that we approach this situation and of each other if this sort of incident does occur. And while acknowledging the impact, we have to make sure to validate and support those who have been targeted. Because if we can relate to having a situation where we may have been on the receiving end of a microaggression, it really can make you feel sad. It can make you feel upset. It can make you feel small. It can make you feel invalid. It can make you feel a variety of things that are not positive feelings. So we want to take the time to be able to, first and foremost, care for the person that has been, that has had the microaggression aimed at them. That is definitely a priority, right? Just making sure that we take care of the individual who has been harmed. And also what we can do is follow up as needed and suggest support systems if you are aware of them, or point folks in the right direction. So for example, if you are intervening on a system and on a microaggression with the person who perpetuated or spoke the microaggression or delivered the microaggression, something that I found is a really handy tool is just having, some websites available that are, or some resources available that you can say, here's a couple of resources that I've come across that may be helpful to you. So help, be generous if you can around, supporting someone's learning. It's not your responsibility by any means, but you can be generous in terms of offering, based on what is available and what is accessible, to be able to point someone in the right direction. So prior to responding to a microaggression, it's Professor Kevin Nadal that suggests there really are a few things that we want to think about, because in a perfect world, we're all able to interrupt every single microaggression every single time we see it. But I want to make sure that we create compassion for those who may not be able to respond to a microaggression in any particular circumstance. And those are for a variety of reasons. So first and foremost, again, prior to responding to a microaggression, there are certain things that we, as those who belong to systemically marginalized groups, or those who we may be serving that belong to systemically marginalized groups, have to consider. Like, if I respond, could my physical safety be in danger? If I respond, will the person become defensive? And will this lead to an argument? If I respond, how will this affect my relationship with that person, whether it's a coworker or a family member? If I don't respond, will I regret not saying something? If I don't respond, does that convey that I accept the behavior or statement? Now, I just want to give a quick example here, because this is something that comes up for us quite often during this workshop. And I want to say that it's okay if you cannot interrupt a microaggression because you may fear for your own safety, or you may fear for the security of your employment. Like, oftentimes we'll have a person of color say, if I say that, if I stand up and I say that is actually not okay to say, or, that is not, that is racist, what may happen, or discriminatory, what may happen is that I may be blacklisted. I may be put in a way that I am seen less favorable, not only by my colleagues, but as the organization. And obviously, in this world that we live today, we have to be able to, to feel some sort of security in and around when it is offered to us. So obviously, if you're in a position where you have employment, you're not necessarily going to compromise that employment in order to intervene with a microaggression, because you need to pay your bills. You need to feed your children. You need to be able to make your art. So be sensitive with yourself. Be kind and sensitive with yourself. That it's good to know how to prepare yourself on how to approach a microaggression and things to consider before responding to a microaggression. But don't be hard on yourself if you are not able to respond in a given moment. You have to take care of yourself. Okay? So that's something we want to be very, very clear on. And that is it, folks. We have come to our last slide. Now, before I close up the workshop with you, I just want to say that this is a lot of content, and we've moved through the content quite quickly, just for the sake of respecting your time. But please, if you feel the need, do go back to certain portions of the workshop and listen to them again, or reflect on them again. We really invite you to use this recording in a way that suits you best. And that when we do this community-based work and when we create with our communities, it really does take us saying that these are the needs of our communities, and that these needs are, all based on the fact that we need to be respectful and care for communities in a way that, hasn't necessarily always been afforded to us in the way that we're supposed to exchange, and the timelines of funders or big corporations don't necessarily align with what it is that we instinctually know and care about within the communities we work with. So honor that path, honor that journey, speak up when you're able to. Give voice to those who don't have the voice or the platform that you may have access to. And also, most importantly, take care of each other. Thank you so much on behalf of Sienna and I for your time, for your attention. Again, if you want to check out some more of our work, we're at communityimpactconsulting.org. If you want to connect with us on social media, we're active on Instagram as well as Facebook. We thank you for your time, your attention, and for what you do, because you're appreciated. And again, thank you so much to Muse Arts for inviting us, and do take care. Thank you all. Bye for now.